Okay, we good? Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to our first Orange Shirt Day event. The Inclusive Excellence Education and Development Hub, or the Hub, known formally as the CSDI, is pleased to have you joining us. My name is Emily Milano, and I'm an Equity and Inclusion Ambassador here at the Hub. Before I start, I would like to mention that we are finalizing the land acknowledgement statement across the SIU system and anticipate it will be released soon. This land acknowledgement will recognize that our campuses exist on and serve a region that includes the traditional homelands of the Illinois Confederacy. This acknowledgement will also be released with additional commitments, pathways, and opportunities for Indigenous students and the advancement of research and knowledge about Indigenous peoples, cultures, and histories. I am now going to introduce Dr. Corey Wilmot, who will be speaking today on the subject of Orange Shirt Day. Dr. Wilmot is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at SIUE, where she teaches cultural anthropology, Native American studies, and museum studies. Originally from Canada, Wilmot did her master's and doctoral research immersed in the Anishinaabe communities throughout Ontario. To reciprocate to the community members, she learned and taught bead and leather work for the First Nations organizations within the Toronto area. From 2004 through 2015, Wilmot was a founding core and board member of the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the study of Aboriginal art and culture. At SIUE, she's a founding and board member of the SIUE IRIS Center and director of the Ethnology Museum and Laboratory in the Department of Anthropology. Wilmot's recent Native American research subjects include a collaboration with Sivan Marks on strap dress reclamation and revitalization. The Voices in Wood, a study and museum exhibit of Northwest Coast carvings in SIUE University Museum. Thank you, Dr. Wilmot, for being here with us today, and the floor is yours for the opening remarks.
Thank you. Emily. Is it Emily?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My sound is echoing.
You should be good now.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, so I've been invited to talk about Orange Shirt Day in part because I'm Canadian and it is a Canadian thing, and in part because my area of research is Native American studies. So I'm going to share my screen with you and have a short PowerPoint that I'm going to present. Right, so Orange Shirt Day, and I am wearing an orange shirt, but it looks kind of pink on the screen here, but it is bright orange, I can assure you. I didn't know what it was when I first heard about it. It's really actually very new. So our first question is, what is Orange Shirt Day? What is it all about? It's really new this year, and it is a response by the Canadian government, the federal government of Canada, to the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 80, which states that the federal government will work with Indigenous people to establish a statutory day to honor survivors of residential schools, their families, and their communities. I'll talk a little bit more about the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation process, but just in introducing the topic of what is Orange Shirt Day, the story is that a residential school student named Phyllis Webstad was stripped of her own orange shirt when she entered residential school. Now, there's nothing unusual about that except that it was an orange shirt. Students entering Native American residential schools, whether they be in the US or in Canada, were routinely stripped of whatever clothes that they came in the door with. The reason for that were twofold. One was that they typically wore uniforms at the schools. And the second was that the people who ran the schools were concerned about the students having transmissible infestations of lice, fleas, mites, and other kinds of insects that were fairly rampant, not only among Native communities, but in many, especially poorer communities around both countries at the time. So Phyllis was stripped of her orange shirt, and it was in 2013, I think, when she first spoke about this experience in public again. And that was the start of a movement, rather locally, to commemorate the reconciliation process that had begun by wearing orange shirts. Okay, so that is the significance of the orange shirts. And that's where we're at today. Well, we are 2 months late, I guess, September, October, November. We're 2 months late on November 30th. And honestly, it's a Canadian thing that started this year. So we're just playing a bit of catch up. And we are celebrating Orange Shirt Day during the Native American Heritage Month. So we'll have to figure that out as, in future years when exactly we should celebrate the Orange Shirt Day, whether in the September or in November. But for now, like I said, we're just kind of playing catch up. And thanks so much to Emily and Shavante for catching this significant commemoration. I'm going to look at the history of residential schools a little bit to see why people who went to them are called survivors and what kind of impacts they had. First, earliest schools that Native Americans went to were run by missionaries, and they were voluntary. This goes all the way back to the 1600s with the Catholic Jesuits, and the Protestants got into the educational field in their Native American missions in the early 1800s. They were fairly small scale, and what would happen frequently is prominent members of Native communities would decide, okay, we'll try this out and we'll send one of our kids to see how it works out. And each of these individual schools was run on its own program. The missionaries were out there with the Native people, kind of just doing their own thing. But what the Native people wanted was they wanted to learn English and they wanted to learn math so that the fur traders wouldn't cheat them in their accounts, and so that they would be able to better understand their political negotiations with government representatives in treaties. Okay, so they had very specific goals in deciding to send their kids to or going to these early schools in the sense of Western style schools, and they were not residential. And I want to point out that up until the War of 1812, there was no border between Canada and the US, that all of this land was Native land. And again, I thank Emily and Shavante for mentioning the land acknowledgement statement that we in the Native American Studies Department have been working on. But in these early days of schools, all of this is Native land. So there isn't the perception at that point that this is going to lead to the kinds of dire results that it eventually did. when we move into the reservation era, and this is going on in the United States and Canada simultaneously, reservation era is because Native peoples were more or less forced into signing treaties and giving away land, and then getting forced onto smaller and smaller portions of land that were, quote, reserved for them. And so in the US, they're called reservations. In Canada, they're called reserves, but they're essentially the same thing. They are little plots of land reserved for Native people. Once they had given the major portion, and I mean like 95% of their land away in treaties. That would be another topic for discussion. But schools on these reservations were relatively small, and they were day schools. They were not residential. The students would come to the school in the day, and they would go home at night. They did not have to wear uniforms. They were for all ages, similar to, and in some cases, integrated with settler one-room schoolhouses. They did have strict schedules, however, and the goal now had changed to that of assimilation, specifically to teach Native peoples how to be farmers in settled communities, as opposed to their former hunting and gathering, which required them to move around a much bigger landscape to exploit the natural resources. So whereas these early schools, their goal was really Christian conversion, it didn't involve things like learning English necessarily, well, they wanted to learn English. They weren't forced to learn English, but it didn't involve learning how to do agricultural tasks or things like laundry for domestic labor or farm labor or shoemaking, or some of the skills that were introduced at this point in the reservation era as trying to make, this is what is assimilation, to, as Richard Henry Pratt said, kill the Indian, save the man. So assimilation was viewed as the liberal and generous way of not slaughtering, massacring all the Indians, but rather slaughtering and massacring the Indianness in them so that they then could become, to be honest, lower class members of mainstream society. And so it was literally the first boarding school. And I should mention that in the US, they're called boarding schools. In Canada, they're called residential schools. The first boarding school was in the US. It was run by Richard Henry Pratt. He opened it in 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. He's a former military officer, and he ran it on a military model. Therefore, he made everyone cut their hair. He gave everyone uniforms. They had an extremely regimented schedule. I mean, there was zero free time. They had to do chores. In fact, they did more chores than they did academic schoolwork. They were all given Christian names and forced upon punishment to speak the English language. There were all kinds of campaigns to convince people in Canada and US that Native Americans could be assimilated or civilized, so to speak, because there was a prevailing feeling that they were no better than animals. Their savage nature had no potential for participating in, quote, civilized society. And so a lot of campaigns were developed to prove that Indians were humans like settlers are humans. And one of those devices was the before and after picture. This one is really famously reproduced over and over and over. You may have even seen it yourself. You can see that they've even doctored up the photograph to make the individual Tom Torlino look darker in his pre-residential school period than he becomes in his post-residential school picture. Even his skin color has somehow miraculously lightened as a result of being assimilated through residential school attendance. And it wasn't until the 1880s that the governments of both countries, US and Canada, got involved and made residential schools mandatory for all Indian children by 1891 in the US and 1920 by Canada, in Canada. They made contracts with churches that were already running the schools. But the thing that happened to the schools as a result of government involvement is they had to have a standardized curriculum. And also the government was able to mandate the attendance. All Indian children had to go. On the churches on their own were not able to say, you had to go there or not. They were dependent on the goodwill and the voluntary attendance of the Native peoples themselves. You can see from the picture of Canada where the residential schools are, that they are in relatively remote areas, especially those ones up north, because it's quite cold in Canada, actually, and where my mom lives, they already had a few snowstorms. So those areas where it's not really conducive to urban development or farming, that's where many of these Native communities remained, and residential schools were built. But they built them not in the reservation, but away from the reservation. They had a theory that the students would benefit from being away from their parents. If they were with their parents, they would backslide into their traditional lifestyles and they couldn't be assimilated properly. That was the theory. And so, although the plan was to put them into mainstream society only at low class, low pay jobs. So girls were trained to do sewing, housekeeping, and cooking, looking after children, laundry, all kinds of menial tasks. And boys were taught trades such as tailoring, shoemaking, blacksmithing, and farming, so that they could perform those menial tasks that their white counterparts were expected to grow into white-collar jobs. I didn't have time to put in a slide on the impacts of residential schools, but I just want to mention here, and I think that some of the videos that Shivante and Emily will be showing shortly will get more into this issue of impacts. Okay, I just want to mention some of them, being alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence, poverty, disease, death, and suicide, separation from communities, among community members and families, loss of heritage, loss of culture, and loss of language. So if you think about taking all these kids away from their families, a whole generation, several generations of kids raised in institutions with draconian punishment policies and lots of physical, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, you begin to grasp the implications of generations of Native people raised in a way in which they cannot be good functioning family members raising their own kids. So many repercussions. So what happens in Canada? In Canada, Native peoples are sort of the number one voice of minority peoples. Canada had very, very, very small scale of slavery. And slavery in Canada actually involved both Black people and Native people, but it was on a very small scale. So it's not like it's very different in Canada than it is here. On the other hand, the Native population in Canada is quite larger, proportionate to the settler population in comparison to the US. So they are more vocal and resist concern, anger, frustration about the residential school system started mounting in Canada to the point where there was some church policy, some church apologies that were publicly announced. And these did not only involve words, they involved money to set up programs, healing programs, and so on. And then it got pushed to the point where the government had to do something. So they initiated what's called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this is based on a model that is actually worldwide. There have been other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in other countries for other purposes. What they do is they research, examine the situation, and that went on from 2007 to 2015, cost $72 million. And the people who were on the commission interviewed 6,500 survivors about their experiences and what they felt could be or should be done about it. When the final report was issued in 2015, it came out with a set of recommendations and also a huge package of money. Sorry, I don't have the exact figure, but enough to initiate wide-scale programs to address these issues. It also set up an annual meeting between the Prime Minister and First Nations, something that President Obama had done when he was president and has not been done until Biden got back. And I think it was actually Jill Biden who reinitiated that program here. So meanwhile, in the United States, what has the United States done to address comparable issues as in Canada? There was an apology in 2009. However, it was in the tiny, teeny, weeny fine print of the massive Defense Appropriations Act of 2010. So it really didn't get much airplay. And what it says is that the federal government apologizes on behalf of the people of the United States to all Native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted on Native peoples by citizens of the United States. So catch this very important distinction that the government is actually taking no responsibility, even though they were majorly involved. Okay, it's just, oh, some people may have done something wrong, and so, we're not really saying that we, the government, have any accountability in this. And furthermore, we're not going to do anything about it. There's no money backing it. There's no policy backing it. It's just a bunch of words. So where are we today? Well, things took a turn when President Biden appointed Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who is a member of the Laguna Pueblo. And one of the first things she did was set up this investigation into the lasting consequences of boarding schools. And she will be leading the investigation. So far, there has not been much reported on what the investigation has found, but just last month, the first initiative seems to be the Wisconsin senator who issued a formal apology to the boarding school survivors in Wisconsin. So this is an evolving story happening right now. And I'm very thankful to my hosts, Shavante and Emily, for being so on the ball and being on top of it. And hopefully SIUE can continue to honor this tradition that started in Canada and see where it's going in the US. So that's my contribution to our discussion. Sorry.
Okay, so we're gonna pull up the videos now. This is really kind of- They should be 2 minutes. I haven't put it in my laptop, but there's anything I don't know.
I'm gonna send them to myself in an email. That'll be easier.
Okay. So we're currently just trying to get the videos pulled up that talks more about like the impact of what happened. And then we're gonna play 2 of them, and then we're gonna explain like the activity, and then we're gonna play the other 2 while we do the activity.
Go back to the Zoom.
Meet your next pillow. Why do we make our pillow the shape of a cube? I'll tell you. The problem with pillows is that they're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, or rather a pillow-shaped peg into a shoulder-shaped hole. This is silly. Look at the space between your head and your shoulder. It's a
Hello, everyone. My
Are you able to see the YouTube on the Zoom?
I am Shawetton from the Strachan, Kenno Creek, Catlin, Dog Creek First Nation, which is about 1.5 hours southwest from Williams Lake, BC. I grew up with my granny on the Dog Creek Reserve until I was 10, then moved with my auntie after she finished university. When I had just turned 6, I was sent to the St. Joseph Indian Residential School near Williams Lake, a place we called the Mission. My granny bought me a shiny new orange shirt to go to school in. When I got there, I was stripped, my clothing taken away, including my new orange shirt, and I never saw it again. I was no longer excited to be going to school. I wanted to go home to Granny. I had to stay there for 300 sleeps. No matter how much all of us little kids cried, it didn't matter. No one listened to us. Our feelings didn't matter. We didn't matter. I am the 3rd generation that attended residential school. Both my grandmother and mother attended the Mission for 10 years each. Today is a day to honor and remember residential school survivors and their families. Every child matters, even if you're an adult. We must also remember those children that never made it and are no longer with us. Today is a day for survivors to tell their stories and for us to listen with open hearts. I am humbled and honored that you are all taking part in Orange Shirt Day. When I was in school, I didn't know my own history, so I am overjoyed that you are taking part and learning the true history of Canada's First Peoples. Guksjem, thank you.
I'm having trouble with it. Can you help me?
You want the next video, right?
Yeah. I just never share screen in Zoom. I think it has. It's like
What are you trying to do?
Play the second video.
there you go. Yep. Okay. I guess not. I'll go the other one. This one's. Okay.
Today, I'm announcing and sharing with you all, first, that the department will launch the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. At no time in history have the records or documentation of this policy been compiled or analyzed to determine the full scope of its reaches and effects. We must uncover the truth about the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of these schools. This investigation will identify past boarding school facilities and sites, the location of known and possible burial sites located at or near school facilities, and the identities and tribal affiliations of children who were taken there. Now, for the first time, this country has a cabinet secretary who is Indigenous. I come from ancestors who endured the horrors of Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead. The same agency that tried to eradicate our culture, our language, our spiritual practices, and our people. To address the intergenerational impact of Indian boarding schools and to promote spiritual and emotional healing in our communities, we must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past, no matter how hard it will be. For more than a century, the Interior Department was responsible for operating the Indian boarding schools across the United States and its territories. We are therefore uniquely positioned to assist in the effort to recover the dark history of these institutions that have haunted our families for too long. It's our responsibility.
Okay, so that was the last video we're gonna play for now. I'm gonna explain the activity. We're gonna do attachment hearts. And then while we do that, we're gonna play a last video since the fourth didn't work out. But the attachment heart originally are hearts made out of orange fabric, and they are stuffed with sage, cedar, tobacco, sweetgrass, and then sewn up. These are considered indigenous medicines and were given to friends, family, and caregivers to show their attachment to that person. We will be altering this activity slightly because sweetgrass and white sage are sacred to indigenous people. We have paper orange hearts and art supplies on the tables, and you can decorate a heart however you want and then give it to whoever you want to show your attachment. So for everybody in the room, the supplies are over there with Shavante, and I will start to get the other video started. Okay, and for anybody in Zoom or joining us online, if you want to do this at home, we have orange construction paper that we are cutting paper hearts out of, and then we have markers, pens, any art supplies, and if you have anything else at home that you like better than markers and pens and pencils, then you can use that, and we're just decorating the hearts and then just giving them to anybody you would like.
And now, a message from Cash App and Megan Thee Stallion.
Bitcoin is not hard to get. You can get it from another.
And here's our last video.
It brings me back to a time in my life, my time when I lived in peace and comfort and safety, and I felt protected by my family. And, excuse me. That was probably the safest time in my life.
Barbara McNabb Larson still remembers the day it changed.
And I remember when they came to get us from here. The first year we went in a livestock truck.
And the next year?
They came out with an army truck. And they drove us back to the school in these trucks. and they unloaded us like we were just little animals.
She is one of thousands forced through the doors for nearly 80 years of Kamloops Residential School.
The first things they did was they took us down to our cleansing room, where they cut off our hair. Then they deloused us. Then they scrubbed us down with disinfectant like we were diseased animals. Sorry.
The name of the institution is now known worldwide. Students always suspected children were buried here, and now they are reliving the horror.
For 3 days, I went into a depression so deep. And a grief that I never knew I had.
No cross or stone, and scarce information to mark who lies buried here.
It's going to be Christmas, and we want to get all ready for Christmas, don't we?
The Catholic Order Sisters of St. Anne's taught at the school.
We have knowledge of maybe about 20 children that died in the school over that 80-year period.
Sister Marie Zeroni belongs to the order.
So there is a hint in the records of another cemetery connected to the school, but we don't know where.
I actually don't know if that reference comes from that school or from another school.
At Kamloops Residential School, the threat of death hung in the air.
You better behave. Don't get out of line, because there's the graveyard. And there's also the river. Those were warnings that were given to us as little tiny children, 5, 6 years old.
Death was real here. We do know how some of these children died. Records from the 1930s were shared with us. Leslie Lewis, 9-year-old boy, died from an epileptic seizure. The Indian agent filed a report noting the overcrowded conditions in the institution. During an epidemic, it is impossible to properly isolate the patient and contacts. The need for separate quarters to house sick children is evident.
I wanted to go home, and I was weeping. I remember there's a train whistle. The trains would go by Kamloops, and I'd hear the whistle. Ooh. And it became one of my triggers later on after I left a residential school. You know, I'll tell you the truth. That years of residential school was like a blur to me. Suicide, I remember this young man or young boy hung himself in the bathroom. Still today, they remember that. They still get nightmares about it. And about the runaways and people jumping trains, getting killed, jumping a train, freezing outside, running away in the wintertime.
There was another girl, Florence Morgan, whose age is not noted, died from a viral infection. The Indian agent reported her body was returned home by truck.
And that's one of the things about life lessons. Say, for example, when you got the strap the first time, I sounded like a coyote, howling and crying. The second time, not much so. Then the third time, he wanted me to cry. And I said, I'm not going to cry. And I went and found a nice spot where there was nobody around, and then I had to cry.
Some never made it home. The girl's name was Mary Francois, age not noted, died in hospital from a blood clot in her brain. Her father, chief of the Adams Lake Band, who only saw her after death, wrote a letter requesting, when a child of the school is taken sick and requires hospital attention, that the parent be notified at once. The community gathered testimonials in this book.
You're growing up, you're not allowed to do something. I wasn't allowed to read this book.
Mike McKenzie reads a passage from survivor James Child.
I walked along the riverbank and I found that student floating in the water by the shore. His body was stiff. For finding that deceased person, I was strapped 150 times on each hand. I think there was a few times that happened.
Mackenzie's father's story is also in here.
My dad, Terry Denault, went to the, we call him Shinny, and he went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We were so young, we didn't know where to turn for help. I was whipped so many times that eventually you get so tough that you block those things out and you can't feel things. That's how it was here.
This oral history fills the gap between the still incomplete record of the residential school era. Many records were pulped by the federal government, including from Kamloops. Funeral records destroyed, Indian agent reports destroyed, student lists destroyed.
Those records were not highly valued in terms of being preserved from the recycling process that went on.
John Malloy, an author and historian who worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
A lot of that information was simply lost.
He said Indian Affairs officials sometimes failed to record information.
We report abuse of these children to you when you don't do anything about it, and therefore we're not going to be bothered reporting to you any longer.
The same lack of care accompanied the death of children.
Children died, children were buried, parents were not necessarily told that they had died. Children were buried in unmarked graves, adjacent to the schools oftentimes.
Death a part of life in residential schools. But there's one institution with key information still in the shadows.
There were records kept by nuns and records kept by priests and sort of diaries. And the claim was made that these were personal documents, right?
Zeroni says a fire at the school destroyed the first 30 years of records. She said they have opened their archives to aid in the search. But as for letting outsiders sift through the more personal files,
I would need to know what it is they're looking for. And no, we wouldn't just turn them all over.
But the one history that can never be hidden is the one carried by those who came home.
I call upon all our people across our Turtle Island, all of our First Nations. It doesn't matter whether you're a Mohawk or a Cree or a Dene or a Shuswap or a Kipkiskan. We're all one people. We're one nation. And it is our cultural and traditional strength, I believe, that has allowed us to carry on and to live.
Jorge, Canadian Cardinal Thomas Collins and the Prime Minister seem to disagree over whether the church did hand over records from residential schools. What did your research show?
Well, they're kind of both right. Most Catholic entities, including the Oblates who ran Kamloops Residential School, turn over records to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But about 17 didn't. What none of them turned over were personnel files, like priests, discipline reports, transfers, diaries that itemize daily life in residential schools. And I've spoken to some who work for the TRC who say it's time to give an independent body subpoena powers to search all church archives in Canada.
And why did the Government of Canada destroy some of the records?
Well, it was an issue of priorities. Indian Affairs prioritized records around land and band membership lists. So when they were faced with edicts to recycle paper because of paper shortages, they saw residential school records as expendable. But we don't even have an idea of what was lost because the government also destroyed files that described the records that were pulped.
Thanks, Jorge.
Introducing new Zevia Creamy Root Beer, rich in flavor and velvety smooth, with a familiar, timeless taste. 0 sugar and 0 calories. Zevia Creamy Root Beer. Delicious moments don't need sugar.
Okay, so that was our last video. Okay. So if there's not any questions, I'm going to go into the closing remarks. I don't think there are. At this time, we're going to do our closing remarks. We all want to thank everyone here again for taking the time to attend today's program and engaging with us. We hope we were able to teach you something new and raise awareness for Orange Shirt Day. If you're interested in learning more about Native American history and heritage, look for more events coming up hosted by the Hub, and beyond that, we have an amazing anthropology department. So you can consider taking an anthropology class next semester. And we want to thank Dr. Corey Wilmot again for sharing your expertise. And if nobody has any questions, then we're gonna close this on Zoom.
Thank you, Emily and Shavante, for putting this program together.
Thank you so much for being here and helping us. Bye, guys.